Okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started. So today's session, I'm going to be going through a spouse client file from start to finish, and it's going to be a really open-ended session. So if you have any questions along the way, you can either just unmute yourself and jump in with your question, or you can send it through the Zoom chat if that's easier. So hopefully everyone can see my screen, and this is the screen that you first get to when you log into the system, and it's going to list all of the different clients that you've added in. So to add a new client, you just go up to this add button, and then the key fields are first name and last name. Everything else is optional. If you want to send the client the online questionnaire, then you have to put in their email and click this use questionnaire box. And then once you add them to the system, it's going to send off an email that says, click here to access your questionnaire. So the client clicks on it. Then they're prompted to make a password just so that their information stays secure and so that they can come back into it at any time so they don't have to do it in one sitting. And then they go through and fill out their profile, family tree, asset, and debt information, and it automatically populates back into your system. So it can save a lot of time with the manual entry. If you want to see what the questionnaire looks like, you can always put your own email in and send the questionnaire to yourself. Just make sure it's a different email than the one associated with your user account, otherwise it won't work. And then we'll go ahead and add the first spouse. And since we're doing spouse clients today, this means we're doing husband and wife will, we're doing wills for both of them, then we need to add them both as clients to the system. So if you're just doing a will for one of them and the other is going to be a beneficiary, you don't need to do this. You can add them to the family tree. But this is if you're doing wills or documents for both of them, then they both need to be added as separate clients. And then you can link them together so that any shared information can be synced. So we're going to go to add. We're going to add the spouse in. So we'll call her Lauren Collins. And then the key trigger here is this spouse client field. So you're going to click on it, and then you're going to pick the name of the other spouse. And you can only do this spouse client field when you're adding the second spouse to the system, just because you need to already put the first spouse in the system in order for them to be a part of the drop-down list so that you can select them. So now, since I've linked Lauren to Ben, this means that any shared family tree or joint asset information between the two is going to populate in both of their profiles. And it also means that I'll have the opportunity to sync appointments and scenarios if their planning is going to be the same or similar. So that can save a lot of time too. So we'll go ahead and add Lauren. And then you have to pick who you want to start with. So I'm going to pick Ben. And this is what you're going to see. So if you haven't sent the client the questionnaire or they haven't filled it out yet, you're just going to start with the client's icon. And for a spouse client file, you're going to have the client and the spouse. And what I usually do is I start by editing the client's information. So you can click edit and it will edit whoever the blue circle is around, or you could just double click on the icon and then it'll bring up that information. And so for anyone on the family tree, the key fields are first name, last name, and gender. You want to make sure to change the gender so that the wording of the will comes out properly so it's not repeating throughout. If you have an also known as field, so Ben's also known as Benny Collins, you can type that in. Date of birth, you can pick it from the calendar or you can type it in as well. So let's say June 6th, 1987. Country of birth, you can do country, you can pick citizenships, multiple citizenships if you need. And then all this other information, this is good to have on the client, this is good to have on your file, but it's not required in order to generate the will. So this is just more for your file to have this information. Then residency, that's important because however you set the province as is how the system's going to know to calculate the probate tax throughout the system. But also, if you're from a province other than Ontario, it's going to, specifically if you're from Nova Scotia or BC right now, we have precedents for those other provinces. So you're going to want to make sure to change the province to BC or Nova Scotia in order to get a BC or Nova Scotia precedent will to generate. But if it's Ontario, you can just leave it as is. The city is also important because it will populate in the will. So it'll say Ben from the city of Toronto. Then special circumstances. So this is a place where you can note any potential capacity issues your client might have. You can just note it down and you can fill in the description below. So this is going to be important because this is how the this is just good to have on your file, especially if you think there might be a will challenge somewhere down the line. You want this stuff really well documented. And then direct relationships is just telling you who Ben is married to, so who Ben's tied to on the family tree. And right now it's just telling us he's married to Lauren because she's the only other person on the family tree. And then we'll go ahead and save. So now let's add a kid. So whoever the blue circle is around is who you're adding to. So you can just click on someone's icon once to get the blue circle around them. If you double click, it'll bring up that information. And then you just go to add child. And whenever you're adding a child, you've got some options as to who the other parent is. So is it the current spouse? Is it an ex-spouse who's going to be involved in the will? Or are they a single parent? So either they're genuinely a single parent or the ex-spouse is not going to be involved in the will. But let's say it's Lauren. Lauren's the other parent. And then we can enter in that child's information. John Collins, we'll say he's male, date of birth, June 7, 2000. And then the special circumstances section for anyone that's not the client. This is a place where you can note relationship difficulties, but most importantly, you can note if this individual is disabled or not. Because if you are going to be doing a Henson Trust later on, you want to make sure this is ticked off so that the system's able to pick up on the fact that they're a disabled beneficiary and then draft that Henson Trust wording accordingly. So that's the key trigger there. If you look at your ad list, you might notice there's no option for grandchild or niece and nephew. And this is just because you have to do it through direct relationship. So instead of adding a grandchild directly to Ben, what you have to do is add a child to Ben and then click on the child's icon to get the blue circle around them and then add a child to them. And that's how you would get the grandchild on the family tree. So we're going to call her Lily Collins, female, and we'll add her in. Same kind of thing for nieces and nephews. You'd click on the client's icon to add a sibling, and then you'd click on the sibling's icon and you'd add a child to that sibling. If there's going to be anybody else involved in the will in either a beneficiary or a trustee capacity that doesn't fit on the family tree, you can go over to this other tab here and add them in here so that later on you'll be able to select them as a beneficiary or a trustee. So you just go add person, you put in their name, you can put in their relationship if you want. This is more for information. And then you can just add them in. So I'm putting in Jordy so that later on I'm going to be able to add him as a trustee or a beneficiary. I'll be able to select him. So that's the people section. Are there any questions so far? If you have any questions, just feel free to either unmute yourself or you can send it through the chat. Nope? Okay, we'll keep going. So that's people. The next section is assets. And so with assets, you're always going to start with the general personal effects, just to remind you to gift them to someone in the will. So you don't have to value them. You can if you want, but more it's just a placeholder to remind you to gift it once we get to the scenarios so that you're triggering that special clause. For any other assets, you can have the client add in all of their assets and with values and give them a sense of what the net value of their estate is looking like at this point in time. But for the will generation itself, you only need to add in assets that are going to be specific asset bequests or registered assets that you want to confirm or do a new designation for in the will. So let's add a couple of assets in. So for any assets, you just go to the add button, then you pick your type or your category and then your type within it. So let's just start with a bank account. So the asset name, that's really the most important field because it's how the asset is identified throughout the system and in the will if you're gifting it as a specific asset. So I usually change the name to have all the identifying information. So maybe it's the RBC bank account with whatever that account number is. I put that all in the asset name so that if you're gifting it in the will, you're knowing the specifics of what you're gifting. But also, if you're just having it in the system for planning and you add in 5 bank accounts and they're all called bank account, it can get kind of confusing. But if one's called the RBC checking account, one's the CRBC savings account, then you can differentiate them and it'll make it easier to plan properly. You can put the balance in and it's going to calculate the probate tax according to whatever you've set the client's residency as back on the People tab. So we set it as Ontario, so it's calculating it for us according to Ontario law. And then we'll just add this one in. Next, let's go to real estate and add a home. So the asset name, again, maybe this is the family home, maybe they have multiple homes. The address field, so if you're going to gift this house specifically in the will and you fill out the address, this is going to populate in the will. You put in a current value, again, it's going to calculate that probate tax. The mortgage/encumbrances field, this is important because if there is a mortgage on this property, you're going to want to put the value of it into this field right here, because not only does it have an effect on the probate tax that's calculated for this asset, but it's also good to know sort of what debt the asset is associated, or what asset the debt is associated with. So for any other debts, we do have a debt section, and there is also an opportunity to add a mortgage in that debt section. But if you're adding a house and there's a mortgage on that property, just put it in this field and don't add it as a separate debt in the debt section, because then it will double count it. So you don't want to add it here and in the debt section because you're going to get double the number. So really, I would just avoid adding it in the debt section at all if it's associated with a specific asset, and I would just add it in this field instead. So let's say ownership. So let's say this is jointly owned. So you can change it from sole to joint. And then if you scroll down, you can indicate who the other joint owner is. So you just click right on add owner, and then you'd click maybe Lauren, the spouse, is the other joint owner, and then you can add. And since we linked these spouses together at the beginning, this family home asset is going to appear in Lauren's profile as well. So we wouldn't have to go in and add it to hers separately. If we switch over to Lauren, we can see that family home. Let's add one more for Ben. Let's say we're going to do an RSP. Again, I would change the asset name to identify it properly. The beneficiary, this is just for information, whoever the current beneficiary is on the policy. So you're going to be able to change it so you can confirm it or do a new designation in the will later on. The current value, this is, as you notice, the probate tax is automatically calculated based on whatever you put for the client's residency. But the income tax, this is a manual calculation if you want to include it. So it's going to be usually what we do for an RSP, we put in like 50% of that value. And for something like an asset that has a capital gain, I'd put in like probably 25% of that gain, just so you're showing the client the highest possible tax they could incur for this asset, just to give them sort of a sense, because values are going to change and different clients have different tax brackets. So this is just showing them the high end. And then later on, you'll be able to show them the savings based on how they plan, and if spousal rollover comes into effect and that sort of thing. So we'll go ahead and add. So does anyone have any questions so far about the assets section? No? Okay. So then we can move on to debts. So the debt section, this is more for planning. So it's not going to have, oh, why is there probate tax on a joint home? That's a good question. So everything on the asset tab, it's going to calculate probate tax as if that asset has fallen inside the estate. So once we get to the actual planning and we drag and drop that asset and show that it's truly joint with someone else, we're going to see the implications of that, and we're going to see that probate tax that gets saved because it's falling outside of the estate. So on the asset tab, it assumes as if it's falling inside the estate, as if the joint ownership is not there.
I just wanted to say hi. Hey, gang.
Hey, Jordy.
How's everybody doing? Glad to see you guys all getting the basic, the new user stuff. Yeah, the probate tax is automatically, as Michaela said, is automatically calculated because there may not be a joint owner when you die, and you'll see how that all plays out as you plan it out for the client. So, but I just wanted to say I'm always here if you guys have any questions that I can help with, and I know you're in good hands with Michaela. And thanks for your interest in eState. So carry on, Michaela. Thanks.
Thanks, Jordy. So on the debts tab, to add a debt, you would just click on this add button. But since we already added that mortgage in on the specific asset, we're not going to add it again here just because we don't want to double count it. So we're not going to do that. But let's say we have a credit card. We'll add in the credit card and then we'll put in the balance and it'll just show that credit card debt. So that's the debt section. Then we get to the actual scenarios, and this is where all of the planning happens. So at most, you plan for each of these three scenarios. So you plan for what happens if the spouse is alive when the client passes. Then you go to what happens if there's the spouse is also passed, but there's kids or grandkids around. And then lastly, what happens when everyone's gone, sort of your ultimate disaster. And by planning for each of these, you're going to cover your bases no matter what happens. So what you can do, you can go through it manually, you can drag things in joint and designated, you can divide up the balance. But what I like to do is use ePlans. So if you go up to this lightning bolt in the top corner, these are basically sort of macros that go through each of the scenarios and the appointments and do planning for you. So that if you're dealing with a typical situation, it's going to save you a lot of time, even if it's not the exact thing that you wanted to do. So I'm going to look at this one, spouse with younger children. And it's telling me in the surviving spouse, it's going to give everything to the spouse. Then in the second scenario, everything to the kids in a trust. And then on the last scenario, half to siblings, half to spouse's siblings. But let's say I like some of that, but I'm probably going to want to change the details of the trust and probably the breakdown of the last scenario. So I'm going to run this and then I'm going to change the details after. We have another question. Do ePlans automatically change depending on who you added in the family tree? No, so they don't. So they're just standard ePlans, and you have to look at the family tree and sort of choose the ePlan that's best for you. So there's only like 6 or 7 in here right now. So it's not going to cover all situations, but it will at least give you a starting point so that, especially if you're dealing with the typical situation, it'll probably do most. And then if not, it'll at least give you something to start with so you're not starting from scratch. So I'm going to run this first one. So I just click on it and it's going to go through and do planning for me. So now I see that stuff's filled out here. We first got this joint designated assets section. So we're seeing that the RSP and the family home have been given to the spouse in this scenario because we ran the ePlan. And if I go over to the summary tab, here's where we're going to see the probate tax and the income tax saved based on this planning. So it's seeing that the family home is joint and falling outside of the estate. So we're seeing that probate tax saving. And then it's spousal rollover. So we're seeing that income tax saving. So this is cool to show the clients for this scenario how they can save taxes. Then the second one's initial gift. And in this, it's going to automatically gift the general personal effects to Lauren. So it generates that special general personal effects clause. So you have to gift that in the initial gift section in order to have that clause generate. And then you've got the balance of the estate. So here We have segment 1, we're going to see the details. So you just do that by clicking on the gray bars. And it's showing us absolute to Lauren for 100%. And if it's absolute, you don't need to put in a gift over in this scenario because it's just going to be covered in the next scenario. So that second scenario is the gift over. So this looks good. I don't need to make any changes to this scenario. So I can move to the next one. So here, nothing is joined or designated. Initial gifts have been given to the children. But let me just show you how you do this if you had to do it manually. You just drag and drop whatever specific asset over, and then you decide, is it absolute or trust that I'm gifting it? For general personal effects, I'm going to say absolute. You can name the children specifically, or you can scroll down this list and you'll get to the classes of children. And then there you go. And then we're going to look at our balance of the estate. So this e-plan created this trust for the children for 100% for the duration when they reach age 30, but I want to change that to 25 instead. And then we have staged lump sums of 50% at 25, but I'm going to say no, I want it to be 25% at 21. So I can make all of those age changes, change the duration, all of that stuff to make a completely different trust than the one in the e-plan, but I have a starting point, so I'm not starting from scratch. So if at least some things are going to be similar to the e-plan, it's best to just run it and then make the changes rather than just starting completely from scratch. And the gift over here, we've got first to beneficiaries issue and then to other class members, so the other children. And then we'll save. And if I've made any changes and I want the changes to be reflected in the spouses as well, so if I want Lauren to have the same descendants only scenario, just click up in the top corner in this spouse sync button and copy everything in this scenario over to hers. So it's going to copy the residue breakdown, anything that's joint between the two. The only thing it's not going to copy are solely owned assets. So if there are any specific asset bequests of solely owned assets, like Ben's solely owned assets, those aren't going to copy over to Lauren because they're not her assets. And sometimes it sees the general personal effects as each of their own solely owned asset. So I'd have to gift Ben's general personal effects, and then I'd have to switch over to Lauren and gift her general personal effects. So that's descendants only. Then we'll go lastly to no descendants. So because of the e-plan, it's giving 50% to siblings, 50% to spouse's sibling. But let's say I don't want to do this. I'm going to start from scratch for this residue for this scenario. So I'm going to give half to Jordy and I'm going to give half to a charity. So we'll start with segment 1 for 50%, and then I'll click add gift and we'll pick Jordy for 100%. This means that 100% of the 50% is going to Jordy. So we're not dividing it up any further. So you don't need to change this to 50%. We want 100% of the 50%. Then maybe we'll put in a gift over to his issue and we'll add. So now we've dealt with, as you can see, 100% of the 50%, so all the green. So we don't want to add another gift because we've already dealt with all of this 50%. What we want to do is add another segment. So you click on this grayed out segments button, and then you click on add segment. So we'll call it segment 2 for the other 50%. And then we'll add a gift to a charity. So if it's already a charity you've added, you can just scroll down and get to it at the bottom. But if not, you can click on the 3 dots, go new charity, and just type it in. So I'm going to say Epilepsy Toronto. And if you have the CRA number, just put it on the name line. Don't just ignore the ID field. It doesn't populate. So just put everything on the name line. And then we'll add. So now we've dealt with this 50% and therefore 100%. And we're going to sync this over to Lauren because she wants the same thing. So that's scenarios. Any questions about this section? No? Okay. So after scenarios is appointments. Because we ran that e-plan, it's going to put Lauren, the spouse, as the primary trustee. So then we'll go and add an alternate. So alternate estate trustee, let's say Jordy. And then to make them an alternate, you're going to put a condition on them. So if they're a primary, we have another question. Are you able to create your own custom e-plan or template? No. So currently you can't create your own e-plan. You just have to go through each of the scenarios and do it manually. Is there a specific plan that you use a lot that you would want there to be an e-plan for? So if there is, you can let me know, and I can see if it's something that we could put over to our developers. But yeah, so when you're appointing people to do a primary, you're going to select the condition as none, and that will make them a primary. If you're selecting an alternate, then you're going to say one of these conditions. So I usually use the first one, if all specified cannot act. So it's going to be Jordy. If Jordy can't act, then Lauren. If Lauren can't act, then Jordy. So for Muslims, we have specific inheritance laws, so that will be a very common scenario. Is it like, maybe we can discuss after, but yeah, that could definitely be an option. So the ones we have now are mostly just for typical situations where you've got sort of everything to spouse, everything to kids, or if you have a separated spouse, then it just deals with the last two scenarios. But otherwise, you can always go through it manually and do the plan yourself. So that'll be able to accommodate that kind of stuff. But yeah, we could definitely discuss about specific things for that kind of population later. So that's how you would do appointments. If you wanted to add a further alternate, you'd pick John. Then I would pick, again, if all specified cannot act. If I wanted to be joint, I would pick Jordy, but I don't. So I'm going to say if Jordy can't act, then John will be appointed. So it'll go Lauren, if Lauren can't act, Jordy, if Jordy can't act, John. And then the sync button for the appointments is actually in the bottom left. So we'll just sync over like that. So that's appointments. Any questions about appointments? Nope. We can move on to provisions. So a couple of things here. The first is funeral arrangements. You can just type them on that line. If not, just delete it and it won't come up. Include future members if you're using class gifts in the will and you want to include future members of the class. So like children, if I click the box, it's going to say my children or my child is John Collins and any other child born to me and Lauren. Class restrictions, same kind of thing. You can restrict certain members of being part of a class. Trust for beneficiaries under a certain age is your general trust clause. So it's going to guide underage beneficiaries that you haven't set up specific trust for in the will, like if it goes to a grandchild through a gift over. And then secondary will assets. So this is just if you're doing primary and secondary wills, here's where you can pick and choose which definitions you want included in the secondary will. So that's provisions. If you're just doing a single will, don't worry about clicking or unclicking anything. Then we have advisor insights. So these are just sort of contextual planning things. It'll let you know if you've missed anything in the system. It'll let you know almost like a checklist of things that you should have considered. And it's going to take the information on what you put in the system. So if you put in a disabled beneficiary or underage children, it's going to advise you on certain planning implications. The next thing is just notes. You can make notes on your client there. Then your last thing is where you generate documents and summaries. So the first one is the profile summary. It's going to give you all the information on the people on your family tree, assets and debts. So it's really good to have on your file, just the information. The second one's the graphic summary. So it's going to give you a nice visual representation of the will for each of the scenarios. And if you're putting in values on assets, this is really pretty because it's sort of showing you the net value of their estate and what's going where. And then the last one is the text scenario summary. So it's showing you sort of all the details of the will, who the trustees are, what the residue breakdown is. It's like the will without the legalese. Then you can go to documents. So if you're on a trial, you can ignore this, but if not, this is when you'd incur the fee if you're on the flex plan. And then we're going to do single will today. So you can change the signing date, you can take it out, whatever you want to do. Registered asset designation is if you want to confirm or do a new designation in the will. Joint designated asset confirmation is if you want some paragraph that says anything that's joint is truly intended to be joint, not held on a resulting trust. Counterpart is signing in counterpart under the new legislation. Simplified is a shorter will with less definitions and powers. Will guide is a nice guide at the end to the clauses, a nice little chart. And a cover page is just a cover page. And for witnesses, right now you can choose anyone else who's a user on your account, or you can click the blank box and you can manually put it in the will. And then you just click generate and it's going to give you a Word document and it's fully editable, so you can make whatever changes you want. I'll just go through it quickly. So if you click the registered asset box, you'll get that funds and plans. This is the joint asset box. Here's our definitions. So because we said future children, it's my children means John and any other child born to. Then here's our trustee or executors. We've got Lauren, if not Lauren, then Jordy, if not Jordy, then John. Here's our special personal effects clause. So it's going to come up with this red highlighting when you give to the children, because you need to decide if the division is going to be in the trustee's discretion or if you want to implement some sort of lottery system. So you're either taking out like this, A, B, and C, or you can leave it in depending. Then you've got residue, so everything to Lauren, if not Lauren, then the children in this trust, and then ultimately half to Jordy, half to the charity. And then I'm just going to scroll to the bottom and it's going to show you the nice little will guide. So it's just going to guide to the clauses in the will. So that's how you do it, and you'd go through it and then you'd go through Lauren's and make any changes to hers and generate hers as well. One last thing I want to point out is this question mark up in the top corner. So if you're ever stuck, you can click on it. It's going to bring you over to our help desk. So you can search through lots of articles with pictures and it can be really helpful. Or you can always email me and I'm happy to jump on a Zoom and help as well. So before we wrap up, does anyone have any final questions? No? Does eState offer the option of storing wills online? No. So anything that you generate, you'd have to save to your own system. But I think Notice Connect is a company that does that sort of thing. So you might want to check that out. No problem. Okay, so I think that sort of wraps up everything for today. But thanks again, everyone, for joining me. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any other questions. Have a great rest of your day.